TAC's Lifetime Achievement Award honors leaders who have devoted their careers to advancing TAC's principles in the public square. And tonight's award winner has done just that across an incredibly varied and accomplished career. Jim Webb, former U.S. Senator from my home state of Virginia, has been a combat Marine, a counsel in the Congress, an Assistant Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the Navy, an Emmy Award-winning journalist and a filmmaker, and the author of 10 books. I don't know how he fit all that in to one career. It's very impressive. While in the Senate, Webb delivered the response to the President's State of the Union address in 2007. He wrote, introduced, and guided to passage the post-9/11 GI Bill, which was the most significant veterans legislation since World War II, and was spotlighted by the Atlantic magazine as one of the world's brave thinkers for possessing two things vanishingly rare in Congress: a conscience and a spine. Webb served with distinction as a Marine Rifle Platoon and Company Commander in Vietnam, but warned even before the invasion of Iraq that it would be a strategic blunder of historic proportions. And on a personal note, I still remember Senator Webb's blockbuster speech at TAC's 2016 Foreign Policy Conference, which he discussed later that night on Tucker Carlson's show. This was right before I myself joined the American Conservative, and it made me want to join the organization all the more. So thank you, Senator Webb, for that. Webb served Congress as counsel to the House Committee on Veterans Affairs from 1977 to 1981. In 1984, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs, and in 1987, he became Secretary of the Navy. In addition to his public service, Webb has enjoyed a varied career as a writer. He received an Emmy Award for his PBS coverage of the U.S. Marines in Beirut in 1983, and in 2004 was embedded with the U.S. military in Afghanistan. I mentioned that he was an accomplished writer. His books include Fields of Fire, which is widely recognized as a classic novel of the Vietnam War, and Born Fighting, a sweeping history of my people, the Scots-Irish, which Tom Wolfe called the most important ethnography in recent American history. I could go on for a while now, but Jim Webb, as you can tell, has had an incredibly accomplished career marked by a refusal to compromise his principles for political expediency. I'm honored tonight to honor him with our Lifetime Achievement Award. Please join me in welcoming Jim Webb.
Thank you very much for that very kind and rather long introduction, Emile, but I want you to know I appreciate it. And this is a Lifetime Achievement Award. So actually, while you were talking about that, I was saying, are you trying to tell me something? And I have to admit this with a little bit of embarrassment that I also am a Georgetown graduate of their law center, but I'm one of the dedicated friends that I have. There was a member of what they call the Nope Club, the Not One Penny Ever, so I've never gone to a reunion. I have to, let me start by saying that I thought the video was very impressive and moving. I would just, I wouldn't want to in any way tarnish it by trying to replicate the message that was in it. Other than this, this is the 20th anniversary of the American Conservative, and when I saw Scott McConnell come up here and give the toast to Pat Buchanan, I was thinking of both of them, because the American Conservative had me at hello 20 years ago when they first came out. It was really like a voice from the wilderness, finally bringing these alternate views in our highly complex society out to the forefront where people can discuss them and see different viewpoints that are not being represented in other areas. The other thing about the anniversary here, the 20th anniversary, since this is a lifetime achievement thing, I would like to start with 20 years ago with an article that I wrote for the Washington Post almost exactly 20 years ago, and it was September the 2nd, 5 months before the invasion of Iraq, and just kind of walk through a little bit how this war and the lead up to the war affected our policies in more ways than just what happened in Iraq. The decision to go to war in Iraq was not a sudden revelation for me. I had served as a journalist in Beirut with the Marines in 1983, and it was quite a look at the region when you think about putting American boots on the ground in that part of the world. And I think the greatest takeaway that I had from the time that I spent in Beirut, when I was with a Marine unit up on the top of a building, there was a concrete terrace up there, and there was like a 3 or 4 sided firefight that started going on among different factions. And a Marine sergeant turned around to me and he said, "Sir, never get involved in a 5-sided argument." And if there was any summary, 1-sentence summary for why we should be so hesitant to put boots on the ground in that part of the world for an extended period of time, he couldn't have said it any better. When thank you. Also, when I was Secretary of the Navy, we had in the Persian Gulf what was called the Tankers War, the Gulf Tankers War. And this was during the time of the Iran-Iraq War, which Cap Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense when I was Assistant Secretary of Defense and then Secretary of the Navy, used to categorize as the worst regime in the world, fighting the second worst regime in the world, and I can't really tell you which one is which. And in this very complex situation in the Persian Gulf in 1987, 1988, we actually tilted toward Iraq in the tanker wars, even though an Iraqi aircraft attacked the USS Stark, one of our ships, and with a Exocet missile that killed 37 American sailors. And even though within 3 years after that, we were at war with Iraq. And if you want just a shorthand on how complex that region is, there couldn't be any better than that situation. So in this Washington Post article, which I am informed that was the first major piece in one of the prevailing media outlets questioning the strategic advisability of going into Iraq, I wrote 5 months before the invasion, "The issue before us is not simply whether the United States should end the regime of Saddam Hussein, but whether we as a nation are prepared to physically occupy territory in the Middle East for the next 30 to 50 years. Those who are pushing for a unilateral war in Iraq know full well that there is no exit strategy if we invade and stay, because they do not intend to leave." The neoconservatives at this time were calling for what they called a MacArthurian regency in Baghdad, modeled after our post-World War II occupation of Japan, not only to include Iraq's regime and changing it, but also to keep a long-term occupation force in place to reconstruct Iraqi society and generally in this region. I wrote, "The Japanese are a homogeneous people who place a high premium on respect, and then they fully cooperated with MacArthur's forces after having been ordered to do so by the emperor. The Iraqis are a multi-ethnic people filled with competing factions who would view a United States occupation as infidels invading the cradle of Islam. In Japan, American occupation forces quickly became 50,000 friends. In Iraq, they would quickly become 50,000 terrorist targets. They did, and they were, including my son Jim, who left college to fight as an enlisted Marine infantryman in Ramadi during some of the worst fighting of that war. He's here today, just finishing having worked on Senator-elect Eric Schmidt's campaign in Missouri, and having before that worked for Rand Paul. So, Jim, thank you. The invasion of Iraq was in all respects a preemptive war. Unilateral wars designed to bring about regime change and a long-term occupation should be undertaken only when the nation's existence is clearly at stake. To paraphrase Leon Trotsky, we were intending to export an ideology at the point of a gun. Instead, we blew Iraq apart, disrupted the entire region, and in the process empowered Iran. The dangers in this invasion to our national security went further. I wrote, nations such as China can only view the prospect of an American military consumed for the next generation by the turmoil of the Middle East as a glorious windfall. And so we had the war. The Iraq War is largely behind us, having blown apart a country, empowered Iran. Afghanistan is now under Taliban rule, no better than it was when we first committed military forces, and indeed probably worse, with a harsh government and a continuing position as a narco state, with Afghanistan by far the world's largest producer of opium. Libya has deteriorated into a full-blown failed state whose ransacked armories following the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi fed weapons throughout the region. Syria is a devastating riddle, and the stability of East Asia, whose waterways carry the world's most vital sea lanes, has become increasingly fragile. We spent trillions of dollars and lost thousands of lives. China prospered at the hands of all of this chaos, although much of the world is now finally and predictably uneasy with its unremitting aggression, particularly in Asia. Over the past decade, the last 10 years, China has been rejecting international law and public opinion while signaling its intent to become the region's dominant power. Beijing has taken down Hong Kong's democracy movement, started military spats with India, disrupted life for tens of millions by damming the headwaters of the Mekong River, conducted a vicious campaign against its own Muslim Uyghurs, escalated tensions with Iran over the Senkaku Islands, consolidated the illegal occupation of islands in the South China Sea, and made repeating gestures to test the international community's resistance in its view to unifying a renegade province of Taiwan. And here's a point for all of us to think about, because it is a window into China's long-term intentions. 10 years ago, China decided to claim the entirety of a disputed area in the South China Sea by creating a new prefecture that extends eastward from the East Asian mainland to the Philippines and nearly as far south as the Strait of Malacca. This new prefecture reports directly to the central government in Beijing. It administers more than 200 islands, that some of which are claimed by as many as 5 different countries. Its total area is nearly twice as large as the land masses of Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines combined. And many of those islands have now been militarized with high-end, sophisticated facilities. In 2012, when this occurred, I raised my concern about this blatant violation of international law in an article for the Wall Street Journal and as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The Obama administration, while boasting of an American pivot toward Asia, declined to criticize China, calling this dangerous diplomatic and military leap simply a sovereignty dispute to be resolved in an international tribunal. But in the eyes of every country in Southeast Asia, our taking such a soft position was an obvious default to China's growing power. I introduced a Senate resolution condemning any use of military force in addressing sovereignty issues in the South China Sea. It passed by a unanimous vote, but the Sanxia prefecture is still there, and China's military presence is steadily growing and becoming more sophisticated. Now, given all these facts, here's something else to consider. China is growing its Navy steadily, year by year, defending these territories and expanding its global reach. And over the years since I was Secretary of the Navy, the United States Navy has been cut in half. When I was commissioned from the Naval Academy in 1968, there were 930 combatants in the United States Navy. We had a war in Vietnam, but we did not have responsibility for the Indian Ocean or the Persian Gulf. The Royal Navy had those. By the time we had done the wind down from Vietnam, we had gone from 930 ships to 479. And our people out there, many of whom were my classmates, were struggling. So one of the comments, one of the jokes, sarcastic jokes that my contemporaries were telling was, make commander and get your divorce because you're going to be at sea constantly. When we took over in the Reagan administration, where I proudly served, the goal was to increase the fleet of the United States Navy to 600 ships. When I was Secretary of the Navy, we reached 568. And then a new Secretary of Defense came in and said he wanted force structure reductions across the board from all the services. And our shipbuilding program got stalled. I resigned as Secretary of the Navy rather than walking that budget over to the Hill. My comment at that time was, thank you, my comment at that time was, I do not choose to become the father of the 350-ship Navy. But 350 ships look pretty good right now. I think they're down to about 280. We must rebuild our Navy for the security of this country and the stability of the regions around the world. And I'd like to close with something that I've been thinking about this for some time, and actually the speech that you just heard, the comments that you just heard, were right on line with the concerns of so many of us. But this is a national security issue too. It's a national security threat, and that is, who are we? Who are we as a nation? How do we process the societal damage of the past few years, the turbulence, the rampant, unchecked lawlessness, the denigration of the icons of the past, the destruction of monuments, the cancellation of names? This is unraveling our history. How does the rest of the world now see us? And how do we see ourselves? Not simply because of a peaceful, a powerful military, or successful banking system, but as an inspiration for human dignity, respect for the law, and greatness of our aspirations as a people. This is our newest and greatest challenge. Our domestic stability is in and of itself a vital national security issue at home and abroad. If the rest of the world is going to look at America as its guiding light, it should see a country whose governmental system is capable of providing safety for its citizens and is controlling its borders and is defending the integrity of the leaders who created the foundations of our country. And so we should ask ourselves and ask our leaders to say enough is enough. That within this multicultural society, in a state of continuous abrasion, our laws should be followed, and dissent should be constructive, in open recognition that we are living and debating inside the most ingenious political system in the history of human civilization. We must reach agreement on that vital point if we expect the rest of the world to continue to follow America's example and move into the unknowns of the future. So let us join together and work to make that happen. Thank you.